Hello, good morning, and welcome to this week's At Home with Zen Gateway for the 21st of April, as we are today. Hope people are bearing up. Hope that you are well in body and mind and heart and soul as well as our time under lockdown still continues. Today, we're going to be looking at the question of transformation of the heart energies. And I'm using a story from Wisdom of the Zen Masters, as we have been doing for the past few weeks. And we'll come to that shortly in a moment. But just to perhaps as a preface, I remember when I first started my own Zen training, my own training in the Buddhist tradition, my teacher said right back at the very beginning, she said, any training that doesn't take into account the emotional household or the emotions cannot lead to any long-lasting change. If we think about how our psyche is structured, obviously we talk about mind and heart. Mind usually is associated with our thinking, our points of view, etc., and the heart with the emotional household. And this is what she was really talking to. It's not enough to sort of pay lip service, as it were, with our mind. We also have to bring with us on this spiritual journey our heart as well. And when we do that, then we find that a genuine transformation can take place. So, having said that, we're back again with the Wisdom of the Zen Masters and today's story. And this story takes place in medieval Japan, in a monastery, in a Zen monastery. So just to remember, people living under monastic conditions live an austere life. There's often little sleep, not an awful lot of food, none of the sort of luxuries or very few of the luxuries that perhaps we as householders are used to, and so it's quite austere, and that's how they live. In a monastery in medieval Japan was an elder monk of whom the young novices stood in much awe, not because he was severe with them, but because nothing ever seemed to ruffle or upset him. So they found him uncanny and were frightened of him. Eventually they felt that they could bear it no longer and decided to put him to the test. One dark winter morning, when it was the elder's office to carry votive tea to the founder's hall, the novices ganged up and hid in a corner of the long and winding corridor leading to it. Just as the elder passed, they rushed out, yelling like a horde of fiends. Without faltering one step, the elder walked on quietly, carefully carrying the tea. At the next bend of the corridor stood, as he knew, a little table. He made for it in the dark, laid the tea bowl down on it, covered it so that no dust could fall into it, but then supported himself against the wall and cried out with shock, "Oh!" A Zen master, telling the story, commented on it. So you see, there is nothing wrong with the emotions, only one must not let them carry one away or interfere with what one is doing. First of all, good morning to everybody. I can see that people have joined us now, so hello to one and all. This is a story, certainly for those who've heard me speak before, that I like very much and have talked on a number of occasions. And I find it very useful, not just because it's in a monastic setting, which, if you like, is a very idealized training session for those of us in a spiritual practice, in a Buddhist practice, but because from it, we can take some of those principles and apply them into our daily life as householders. And that's obviously important. This stuff needs to be relevant for us. So this story is talking about strength. This story is talking about young monks, and it's interesting the way it puts them. There was this elder monk, and nothing ever seemed to ruffle or upset him. He had a certain equipoise. He had a certain visible strength, not a bullish strength, not an aggressive strength, but a real solidity, like a mountain. And this, the younger monks found, it says they were frightened of him, and they found it uncanny. And uncanny is an interesting word to choose, because sometimes we do run across people like this who do seem to have an uncanny strength. It almost seems to come from a place beyond them, as if it's not that they possess it, but they are possessed by it. And it's a gentle strength. As I say, it's a very different strength, and we'll be looking at this different types of strength because there are different qualities, and we need to be clear exactly what we are talking about. And it may seem in some ways, because obviously in Buddhism and certainly in Zen, there's lots of talk of enlightenment and satori and things like that. We may sort of think, well, what is it about this strength then? Why is it so important? And again, I remember Venerable Myokyoni, when she went to train in Japan, she went obviously as a European. She'd read all the books about the Zen masters and enlightenment and all this sort of thing. And when she got to Japan, she was obviously training as a laywoman in a monastery. And she talked with some of the other Japanese lay parishioners who would come along to the temples as well. And she would ask them why they came. And all of them, she said, replied the same way: we want the strength. And to be honest, she was disappointed with that answer, because, for her, Zen was something very mysterious, very mystical. And this was, I think, the thing that had really piqued her interest, had caught her attention. And she felt a little bit that, that just coming for the strength was somehow a little bit mundane. But as she said, it was several years into her own training when one day that memory came up, and she suddenly realized, yes, of course, that is exactly why we are here. That is exactly why we are training. Why? Because in the training, when we practice meditation, when we practice mindfulness, we become aware of this other side of us. So if you please, our minds are attracted to Zen. We think about it, maybe we fantasize about it a little bit. But as we do so, we also become aware of our heart as well. We become aware that we are a ragtag bag of impulses that are always pulling in lots of different directions. And the Buddha gave a very nice parable about this. He said, if you imagine that you had 5 different animals and they were all tied together, one was a horse, one was a crocodile, one was a wolf, one was a buffalo, and one was a dog. And they're all tied together and they're all pulling in different directions. The crocodile wants to go back to the river. The horse wants to go to the meadow. The wolf wants to go to the forest. The dog wants to go back to the farmyard. And there they are, pulling in different directions. Now, the strongest animal amongst them is going to be the buffalo. And so he can pull the rest of them along in one particular direction. But it's hard work. And after a while, he becomes fatigued. And so he begins to lose strength. And then the next strongest animal, which is the crocodile, begins to pull them all back into the direction of the river. And then he becomes fatigued. And then the dog picks it up and tries to pull them all in the direction of the farmyard. And then the bull, the buffalo, gets his strength back and begins to pull them again towards the field. And so it goes on in this sort of way. And perhaps we can see in this parable something very common in ourselves. Maybe over the past few weeks, if you think back to when we started this lockdown, maybe we were full of ideas about, oh, well, I'm going to take the opportunity to use this time productively. I'm going to get up at a certain time and I'm not going to just sit and watch TV, and we're going to do this, that, and the other. And maybe I'll learn a new language. Who knows? And we started off with lots of really good, positive resolutions. How many are we keeping up? How effective have we actually been? Have we found that actually some of that sort of positivity has become fatigued? And as it became fatigued, then other impulses began to come up and carry us away. And maybe later on, we sort of think, oh, I wish I'd done more with that time, etc. And we can sort of regret it. This is the strength. This is the strength that was being referred to by those Japanese parishioners. The strength, for example, to be able to hold oneself together and to apply oneself in a particular direction, to see something through no matter what. It's resilience. It's the ability to be resilient to the onslaughts of one's own impulses, and yet having carefully decided and thought about and dedicated oneself to a particular path, to be able to see it through to completion. That is a tremendous power. To be congruent, to have one's life congruent in this way. And if you look, for example, going back to the monastic life, if you have a look at how monks live, and when I say monks, I'm including women and men in this, by the way. The term monk, I know we use the term nun in the West, but it's actually the same word. So people who are living under holy orders in this way are developing that strength. They pair off a lot of the sort of excess things that are considered unnecessary in order to live the holy life that they do. And what they get out of it is a strength. That is the sort of process. And that strength is tremendously appealing to people who don't have it. And I remember, again, when Myokyoni was coming back to London after having spent 12 years in Japan, she was summoned by her then teacher, Sojun Roshi, who said to her, "What are you going to do when you get back to London?" And she said, well, when I get back, there's a little Zen group there already that's been set up at the Buddhist Society. So we'll probably, formulate it, and we'll sort of expand it a little bit, and we'll have sessions and retreats. And maybe you'd like to come over and give some talks as well. And we can turn it into a real sort of training ground. As she said, I should have known better to keep my mouth shut, because he turned and looked at me and said, "You will do no such thing." She said, "When you get back, you will find a park bench at Heathrow Airport, and there you will sit on that bench with your bags around you, and you will sit on that bench, and you will just carry on sitting on that bench. And either one of two things will happen. Either you will die, in which case there's no further problem, or people will begin to notice you. And they'll begin to query in themselves, what is it that she's doing? Why is it that she's sitting there? Why is it that she goes on sitting there?" And then they will begin to wonder, what is it that gives her the strength to carry on sitting there? And then they'll come up and ask you for that strength, and then you can teach them. As she said, when she got back to Heathrow Airport, fortunately, Christmas Humphreys was there to pick her up in the car and take her back to St. John's Wood. However, she remembered the spirit of that, not to be beholden, to allow people to come naturally to the teaching, because they see something in it that they want. They see something towards which they want to aspire. And that aspiration is tremendously important as well. So one other thing just to say about this, Master Mumon, who was a Chinese Zen master, who compiled the Mumon Kan, a famous koan collection, said, "The treasures of the house do not come in through the front gate." And we may have had this before. And what he meant by this, quite simply, was that the treasures of the house he's referring to is the strength and the wisdom of the Buddha nature, but also the strength, this power that we're talking about. And what he's saying is that this strength is innate. If we don't feel very strong, if we feel that we are subject to our impulses, if we do feel that we're being dragged hither and thither all the time, and that we find it very difficult to pull ourselves together and really apply ourselves, he says it's not because we don't have the strength. It's because our strength is dispersed. It is pulling in different directions, like those 5 animals who are all tied together. And this is why in the northern tradition of Buddhism, in the Mahayana, there is that curious saying that the passions are the Buddha nature, and the Buddha nature is the passions. Now, this is not to say that, me losing my temper is me expressing my Buddha nature. It is not. Anger is anger, and the wisdom and the compassion, the strength and the warmth of heart of the Buddha nature is a quite different form. However, it is the same energy that informs both. So, perhaps to start with, if we feel that we don't have that strength, perhaps just start with, just sort of ponder for a moment, just take a moment and bring to mind the last time you were really, really angry. Okay? When you were really upset, and not just upset, but angry, in quite a rage. It was powerful, wasn't it? There's no denying that in that period of time when we were suffused with that angry energy, there was a tremendous strength there. So that energy, that power, the power in the emotions, is the energy of life itself. This is why it's called the energy of the Buddha nature, because the Buddha nature is a technical term in Buddhism that we use to mean life with a capital L. It's the informing spirit, it's the informing, animating principle of living beings, and it's also intelligent as well. It isn't like a blind mechanistic force. This is an intelligent, extremely powerful force, which, like the treasures of the house, is inherent in us. It is inborn in us. This is what we refer to as the Buddha nature. However, for various reasons, it's covered over. For various reasons, quite often we are not actually aware of it, and yet we are aware of it. We're aware of its power. We're aware of its power to create and to destroy. Our desires and our hatreds certainly can do all that. If you look around us at the world in which we live, both the tremendous things that humanity has accomplished over millennia, and also the terrible things that we have enacted on each other as well, both these things require terrific strength and also intelligence in order to be able to bring them about. This strength and this intelligence is inborn in that energy. However, in the form of the passions, it is blind. And this is the teaching of the Buddha. He recognized that the only problem with the passions of our sort of insatiable greed and also of our fear and our anger and our delusion as well, our opinionatedness, our stubbornness, and so forth. All these things have a tremendous strength in them, but the Buddha nature that informs them is covered over by them. It's like a cloud before the sun, or a curtain before a window. We cannot see through it clearly. And yet we are aware, at least distantly, we are aware of this strength, which is why we're attracted to people who show it, and why we're attracted to people who have it. I remember as well the tremendously transformational power of this energy. This energy is a shape-shifting power. It has the power to turn one thing into another, rather like when children, if you give a child a fairy liquid bottle, they can turn it into a rocket or into a ray gun, or they can turn a stick into a sword or into an arrow or something like that. In other words, in imagination, this energy becomes highly transformational as well, and we are aware of this. We are aware of this too, and I do remember actually many years ago when I used to work for a trade union. I noticed that Jackie, you're in the talk as well, and I used to work with Jackie for quite a number of years, but this was actually even a little bit, I think, before you came. But I remember there was a particular union officer there who was highly respected but also quite feared as well. And the reason that he was feared is that he had a hair trigger temper. But as a union official, that was actually quite a good thing. Because if you think about it, you've got to go into very difficult combative situations, and to be able to bang the tables at times, and to be able to put the fear of God into people in order to get what you're after on behalf of your members. And so he was actually very good at what he did, but he had this hair trigger temper. And I remember one day he came back, and there was a woman who was on reception, someone I knew quite well, and he came up to her and he suddenly picked on her for something that actually wasn't her fault. She told me about this. And anyway, so he had this blazing row with her in the middle of the reception of the head office. And then he stormed off to his own office upstairs. So she called a colleague to sit on reception, and she went straight upstairs because she was no shrinking violet. And she walked straight into his office, and she said, right, first of all, what you were complaining about had nothing to do with me, number one. Number two, you never have a blazing row with someone in the middle of reception in public like that. You know, people are coming backwards and forwards. You just don't do it. And number three, you do not speak to work colleagues like that ever. And he held his hands up and he said, yep, you're right. I was in the wrong. I'm sorry. I had a really bad meeting and you were the first person I saw. And he basically offloaded it onto her. Now, that was a really interesting thing, looking at it in hindsight. It was a really interesting sort of incident in hindsight, because clearly he knows that his temper, he wields his temper like a weapon. And it's a little bit like, I'm quite a fan of folklore, as those of you who know me will remember. In folklore, there's this thing about making a pact with the devil. You know, the devil comes along, he promises you something great, you sign over your soul, and in 7 or 20 years or whatever, he comes and collects your soul. But, you know, you have been given your earthly goods, your earthly treasures, so to speak. Now, I used to remember reading that thinking, well, who would actually make a deal like that? I mean, that's a really, really bad deal. You know, 7 years or even 20 years or even 100 years of having everything, all your earthly delights and pleasures satisfied is nothing compared to an eternity in hell. You know, surely no one would do that. And of course, the answer to that is no one would consciously do that. However, we can unconsciously do it. We can unconsciously make a pact, maybe not with the devil, but in his case, with an anger devil. So for him, he obviously found at quite an early age that if he banged the table, if he shouted, if he confronted people forcefully, most people don't like that. Most people will back down and give you what you want for a quiet life. And that works to the advantage of someone who's prepared to do that. Now, in that way, we think of our anger as sort of like a tool, an instrument that I can use to get what I want. That's the pact that we've actually made with the anger devil. But what we forget is that our anger is not a tool. Our anger is a living being. It's a sentient being. It's an anger devil. And the more you feed the anger devil, well, the more life does what life always does, which is it grows bigger and it reproduces, and it grows bigger and it reproduces, and it begins to populate the personality more and more. And this then becomes a trend in the personality. It begins to skew the personality into a particular direction. And this is what had happened with him. And of course, after a while, instead of him using the anger begins to use him instead. And this is what was happening now. So now his ability to be able to tolerate things that he didn't like was becoming gradually eroded, gradually becoming less and less. In other words, he was becoming less resilient. His strength was going into the anger and less into the capacity to be able to contain himself, to hold himself together. So this is the important thing about the passions. The passions are blind and willful, basically. And they have a tendency to pull us apart as well. And this is why it's not a good thing to make a pact with an anger devil, or with a desire devil, or with a sickness devil. I knew another guy who, every time he was faced with something that he didn't like, would develop an ailment, would fall sick. And sometimes he was hospitalized for it. And sometimes it nearly killed him. But this thing, he had learnt at an early age, if he did this, he could get out of things that he didn't like. But over time, it grew and it grew and it grew, and then it began to take him over and dragged him away. That's the pact making. And we need to be careful not to do that unconsciously. So the passions of the Buddha nature, this is when, so we've been looking at, for example, when the passions are really sort of out there. But what about the other side? What about people who don't feel that they have strong passions? And there are plenty about. These are the people whose feelings are a bit more repressed. They regard themselves as sort of quiet, unflappable, very logical, and so forth. In fact, they can sometimes be quite irritating to the former people. Those who are a little bit more wear your feelings on your arm can sometimes get irritated. Why don't you ever react to anything? You never seem interested. It's sort of like that, You get those sort of opposites thing. Well, there is that other way. So there's some people who absolutely wear all their feelings on the outside, and others who are so on the inside and so pushed down that in fact they don't feel that it's there. And in this case, something a little bit different is needed. And usually what they need is stirring up. So with the former ones, the ones who are a bit more explosive, they need reining in. And we'll look at that in a moment. But the other ones, they need sort of stirring up a little bit. And actually, I'm a little bit like that too. I tend to sort of internalize things a bit more. And it's just, my upbringing and so forth, family members, etc., and so forth. And I remember, again, when doing this, beginning this practice and learning about this process of working with the emotional household, which is what I've been talking about, and being very intrigued by it, and understanding intellectually how important it was, and that, for the transformation to take place, the heart has to be involved too, and the heart energies obviously have to be involved too. It's not enough just to believe something or learn something. It has to really go right in very deep into our gut. And then, as often happens, the Dharma plays its hand. And again, I was at the Union, and this was even earlier in my sort of career there. And I had a boss at the time of whom I was terrified, and I hated him for that, to be perfectly honest. He was paranoid, and it sort of meant that anyone who sort of expressed anything that he felt threatened by usually found themselves out on their ear. And so we tended to, repress. We didn't show what we felt, or I certainly didn't anyway. Those who did were out on their ear. And so this went on for a long time, and my resentment of him grew and grew and grew. And I used to have these fantasies, as often happens if that energy, when it comes up, has to go somewhere. If it doesn't go into something physical, say, then it sort of squeezes up into the mind and becomes fantasies, So I used to have these fantasies of him being destroyed, and, maybe when I got into work on a Monday morning, maybe he'd been in a fatal car accident, something like that, all that sort of thing. It got quite violent, actually, at one point. And, there's a little bit of me, because I resented it, I played along with it. I sort of indulged in these fantasies too. Outwardly, there was nothing, but inwardly, it was all playing inwardly. And then one day, the whole thing sort of came to a head for me one day when I was on a bus. Something had happened that day, and I'd become really upset by it. The fantasies were very powerful, very passionate in my own mind. And I was on the bus, and I was in the middle of one of these sort of inner fantasy storms. And I just happened to look up, and sitting opposite me on the bus was this woman who was looking at me with absolute horror. And I suddenly realized that the fantasy must have contorted my face into some kind of raging demon. And that really shocked me. That was like a bucket of ice cold water in my face. And I suddenly realized I had better do something about this, because going on at this rate, indulging these fantasies at this particular rate, was not healthy. All it required was for it to just go to reach a tipping point, and bang, something very bad could happen. And that's when I realized then that I had to do something about it. And suddenly, and this is what I mean when I say the Dharma really played at hand, this was a lesson from the Dharma. Suddenly, I realized that now I was working with the fires for my life. because otherwise, if they exploded, they threatened to destroy my life as I was living it. And who knows what could have happened. And so what that meant in my own particular case is to become aware when those fantasies were beginning to come up, and then immediately, as it were, to take a breath, open out, and to feel the rage in the frame, to really open up, make the body as big as possible. And then, if possible, I can put the hands together and just bow. And we used to say, the fires still burn, I am still here. Please, burn precious energy, burn me away. Or even just say yes. But there was that acknowledgement of the living power of it. And it was a fascinating thing what happened when we come up to that. When that actually happens, there's a sort of, there's a few moments of letting go. As soon as the thoughts are let go of and we come into the body and we, as it were, feel the energy in that space, the body becomes quite light. And in that state, we have to be careful now, because very easily that energy wants to discharge itself, maybe in a shout or maybe in slamming a door or something like that. And so we have to move a little bit more slowly, speak a little bit more slowly, and a little bit more politely. So this is where a practice of restraint comes in. And then having then had that energy all stirred up, which is of course what we need, it needs to become conscious. We then apply the restraints. And of course, for us in a Buddhist lay practice, we have our 5 Buddhist precepts: not to cause harm, not to steal, not to lie or use false speech, to avoid sexual harm, and to avoid intoxication as well. And that includes intoxication by fantasies and opinions too. Perhaps more important than drinking whiskey. At least with whiskey, you're sober in the morning, but with a fanatic, they don't sober up, at least not just in the morning. So having the precepts there is provides our framework. If we know we're operating within those precepts, then we know we are operating within a human framework. They're tried and tested. They're just the common human decencies. I mean, they're not even particularly Buddhist, let's be honest. But they do keep us safe. It's interesting that the Chinese used to call the precepts the protections, because they protect us and they protect other people from the extremes of the passions. And the other thing then, particularly in our school, in the Zen school, is that we use a politeness. We use good manners. This isn't, but a sort of caveat on that. This is not to be taken as some kind of, right, now we're going to be sort of rather obsequious, or, now we become a doormat for people just to walk over us. Because that politeness is coupled with a straightforwardness as well. It's not about, so for example, if something upsets us, it's not that we ignore the upset or that we blame ourselves for the upset instead of blaming others. What we do is we process that energy, but the complaint, if it's a valid one, can be spoken about, can be addressed, but it can be addressed in a human way, not as a fighting demon, not as an anger devil. Hopefully that's clear, and that straightforwardness is really useful. Just as a little example of that, and again, I've mentioned Miyake a number of times, but she was my late teacher, and so was a very important figure in my life. She gave an example. So one day she returned to the temple, having given a talk at the Buddhist Society, and she was the last person through the gate. And she was supposed to have locked it, and she forgot. And so the following morning, after breakfast, when they're allowed to talk a little bit, the person who was responsible for unlocking the gate in the morning piped up and said, "Have we changed the rules?" And Miyake only said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Have we changed the rules about locking the gate now in the evening?" Miyake only thought for a moment and then said, "Do you mean to say I didn't lock the gate in the evening?" And she said, "Yes." Then she said, "Well, then why don't you just say that instead of beating around the bush?" That's the straightforwardness that's talking about. You can be quite polite. You can address someone or something or somebody in a straightforward but polite and restrained way. That's the human way. It avoids either shouting your head off and being unpleasant, turning into a fighting demon, or, as it were, sort of not addressing things. and then these things get swept under the carpet, and then eventually they become volcanic and explode. So so hopefully that gives a little bit of a taste. This is a very large subject, and I don't want to go on about it for too long, and we will return again. But I really just wanted to introduce this teaching of working with the fires, the passions of the Buddha nature is the passions, and the alchemy of the transformation of the psyche. One final thing I just would like to throw into the mix, though, and that is that obviously in the Mahayana, one other important factor provides the context for all our training, and that is the Bodhisattva Vows. The Bodhisattva Vows are the vows that we make to be of assistance to the community, to all sentient beings. The traditional classic formulation is sentient beings are numberless, I vow to assist them all. And that's sentient beings are numberless, I vow to assist them all. It has within it that sense of service. And the reason that that's important is because when we are looking at this, perhaps we could call it a more psychological work, it can very easily fall back onto I and me and mine and my progress and, you know, my energies and my enlightenment and all that sort of stuff. And it very easily goes wrong that way. It becomes selfish. So to have it nested within the vows of the Bodhisattva to be of assistance to others makes it more outward facing and keeps us tied into the community. The reason we do this work, the raison d'etre of doing this work, is to be of service. That gives it the meaning for everything that we do. Because in a way, you know, when you excuse yourself from your family, and you go and sit meditation for half an hour, or whatever, and your family may sort of think, you know, oh, you're being a bit selfish, just going off on your own and doing that. And it would be true if you were just doing it for your own good. But if you're doing it because actually it makes you a better person, and being a better person is a benefit to other people, then it's justified. Then it has meaning in connection with the wider community within which we are. So those Bodhisattva vows are also important. We can take those in the morning as well. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to assist them all. The passions are manifold, I vow to transform them all. The Buddha gates, or the Buddha's teachings, are many, I vow to learn them all. The Buddha's way is supreme, and I vow to walk it to the end. So with that, I'll say thank you. Does anyone have any questions? If so, just put them into the comments box. I'll leave it going for another 30 seconds or so if anybody has any questions. If you do think up of something, and I'm not quite sure how immediate some of these things are, so you might be typing and pressing enter and it's not coming up. If that is the case, I will come back to this later, because I think, as you all know now, this is being recorded and it goes straight onto the Facebook timeline. So just put your question underneath there. I will look back at it over the next 48 hours and then I will happy to provide an answer for you. Otherwise, good morning all. I hope you're well. We're nice and sunny here in London at the moment. Hope you're all bearing up under the lockdown, and stay well, stay safe, and good practice. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.